Hi everyone, I am here with the story, a true story for you. Haven't done these in a while. It's from our book, Amazing Stories of Life After Death. Okay. Chapter 9. This one has a Bible verse before it, which is Proverbs chapter 14, verse 26, which says, "In the reverent and worshipful fear of the Lord, there is strong confidence, and his children shall always have a place of refuge." And this story is called Yes, Lord. Living in a small town like Yadkinville, North Carolina, has its advantages. Most people know each other. People very seldom lock their doors, and children ride their bicycles on the streets without the worry of being kidnapped. Nursing runs in the Tomlin family, so it was no surprise when at age 16, Rebecca started her career as a nurse's aide at the 60-bed Lula Conrad Hoots Memorial. She went on to receive her degree as a licensed practical nurse from Gulford Technical Community College. Soon after graduation, she returned to Hoots. One day, a man in his mid-80s, Mr. Collins, was brought into the emergency room after being found unresponsive by his son. The emergency room doctor determined that Mr. Collins' diabetes was out of control, and he needed to be admitted. He was a frail-looking man with a meek spirit. He was so humble and had that special sparkle in his eyes. Nurses and doctors fell in love with him immediately. A week into his stay, the sparkle in Mr. Collins' eyes disappeared when his son decided to put him in a nursing home. That answered the question a number of nurses had about whether or not Mr. Collins would get strong enough to go home and take care of himself. During that week in the hospital, Mr. Collins, like many patients, had some good days and some bad days. There were days that he was so weak that nurses had to help him turn over in bed. A few more days had passed, and the nurse on first shift was reporting off to Rebecca. She had reported that Mr. Collins had a good day. He was more alert and had sat up in the chair for a few hours. She was excited for him and thought that maybe his health was turning around. That evening, nurses on the hall were very busy with admissions, labs, assessing patients, and getting medications out to them before 4 p.m. Supper was to be served an hour later, so Rebecca had plenty of time to distribute her medicines. She entered the 4-bed ward of room 63. The patients in the room were ambulatory, except for Mr. Collins. Because of that, Rebecca gave Mr. Collins his medicine last, so that she could take more time to assist him. That day, he was not sleeping as usual. Instead, he stared at the ceiling. As Rebecca approached him, putting his medicine down on his nightstand and proceeding to pour some fresh water in his cup, she asked, "Mr. Collins, how are you?" I'd say he sees something up there. She paused, then said, "I have your medicine." He didn't acknowledge her and continued to stare intensely at the ceiling. Then he said, "Yes, Lord, I see you now." I believe wholeheartedly he did too. I could tell you stories of people that seen things and heard things before they died, and it happened just like they said, and it was amazing. Amazing. I do believe God comes to people when they're dying, or sends his angels or a loved one to them when they're dying to help them cross over. I truly believe that with all my heart. Rebecca took a closer look at the ceiling, but of course she couldn't see it, it wasn't meant for her to see, but didn't see anything. People People think you're crazy, when you say you see things. That's why you got to be careful who you say it to, and you mostly got to keep it to yourself. Unless, you're dying, but they still think you're crazy. Oh, it's just the medicine talking, or it's this or that. But I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a second. She then tried to get his attention again by touching his shoulder. "Mr. Collins, can you take your medicine for me?" As he looked at her slightly agitated, she placed the pills in his mouth and gave him water. Mr. Collins swallowed and redirected his gaze toward the ceiling. Finished with him, she left the room only to hear him say, "Lord, just please do not make it hard on them." Rebecca returned to the nurse's station after distributing her medicines, wondering what was going on with Mr. Collins. He has never acted this way before, she thought. A few more minutes had passed when a nurse's aide came running up to the desk. "Something is wrong with Mr. Collins. I think he is gone," she said. With the aide following her, Rebecca ran down to the hall and turned into his room. When she reached his bed, he wasn't breathing. The duo started CPR and continued until the doctor arrived and pronounced his time of death. While they waited for Mr. Collins' son to arrive at the hospital, Rebecca replayed the scenario from earlier. Now, you think he was just looking up at the ceiling and talking to God, and then he just happened to die? You think that was a coincidence? No, not me. She realized Mr. Collins was in the presence of the Lord when she interrupted him to take a pill and now seemed trivial. She could hear him saying again in her head, "Yes, Lord, I see you now. And Lord, just don't make it hard on them." A joyful feeling came over Rebecca at the realization that Mr. Collins was with Jesus and the angels in heaven. She knew, no nursing home for him, guys. She knew that he was having a conversation with God, and she interrupted them. She also knew he was no longer suffered, and now with his loved ones who had gone on before him. When Mr. Collins' son arrived at the hospital, he spoke with the doctor. Rebecca found him standing at his dad's bedside, trying to understand and realize that his dad had passed. Rebecca placed her hand on his shoulder and told him about the conversation his dad had earlier that evening with God and his angels, and how she felt that they had come to take him to his heavenly home. Some people wouldn't believe it, though. She also told him what an inspiration his dad was in his faith, and how his dad lifted and strengthened her heart. Rebecca could feel the weight lift from his shoulders, and he agreed that he knew that his dad was in a better place. He seemed comforted again to be reminded of his dad's love and that the angels had taken him home. Many people have reported their loved ones describing angels during the transition from life to death. Angels help guide us into God's holy presence when our work on earth is done. We see an account of this in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus gives a description of Lazarus' death in Luke 16:19 through 22. We read, "There was a certain rich man who habitually clothed himself in purple," which was for fancy, royalty back then, "and fine linen, and reveled and feasted and made merry in splendor every day. And at his gate there was carelessly dropped down and left a certain utterly destitute man named Lazarus, reduced to begging alms and covered with ulcered sores." If you had money and food like that, how could you let someone suffer like that right there at your door? He eagerly desired to be satisfied with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs even came and licked his sores. and it occurred that the man, reduced to begging, died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. But not so the rich man. He in the medical profession sometimes have the privilege of sharing in sweet moments like this. We feel the person who has just died must have seen either an angel or Jesus as they pass from this world to the next. These are tender, touching experiences. They provide a grieving family with a precious gift, the comfort of knowing for certain where their loved one will spend eternity. In some ways, nurses are like angels. They care for those in need, often during their darkest hours. In fact, a nurse's goal must be to care for the patient's needs and to make them as comfortable as possible during their time of recovery or passing. In a similar way, our Father sends the angels to care for mankind. He assigns angels to help us with every need, to make us as comfortable as possible as we face times of trial and testing, and to usher us into God's presence when our time on earth is done. Amen, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this story. Good night.